This is one of those weeks where, with everything else going on, the sermon decided to resist. So, we wrestle on. The second reading continues in the 12th chapter of the Gospel according to Mark, picking up with the 13th verse. Then they, the leadership, sent to him, Jesus, some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came to him and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, Jesus said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. Then he said to them, "Whose head is on this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Jesus said to them, "Give the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. May God's blessing continue to fall on us through the experiences of Scripture on this day. May it guide the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips. We're in a new worship series, World Crucified. If we were to be reading the gospel straight through and not sort of bending it around the liturgical calendar, we would be in Jerusalem. We are in Jerusalem. This is a Holy Week story. We'll back up and get Jesus into Jerusalem in a couple weeks. But this is a Holy Week story. This is probably some of the earliest teachings of the church. Because after the resurrection, the stories that are told first and foremost are the Passion Week, the Holy Week stories. And then we build out from there. So these teachings are the ones that people, followers of Christ, people who come to God through Jesus in the very beginning, these are some of those teachings that drove them, that drew them, that inspired them, that scared them. This Holy Week moment, a story offered to insult, to provoke. And as I was putting the series together, as I was looking at these texts and thinking about where we were going with them, thinking about the seasons that we are in and the life that we are living with social media access and things along those lines. I was listening to something on the radio today and on the way in, and they were talking about why newspapers are important. And it's not the paper itself, it's the newsroom, people actually vetting the news instead of just putting out whatever crosses your plate. I'm guilty of that sometimes. But as I was putting it together and I was thinking about Jesus in this week and the fact that he's going to the cross and what Mark is saying about the things that Jesus is pushing against, I started thinking about the things of the world that should have been crucified with Christ. Paul says that when crucifixion occurred, sins were forgiven, and when resurrection occurs, the things of the world are left nailed to the cross. That's functionally what Paul gets at. Some of our earliest writings of faith. And I thought about the issue of false equivalency. I think we do it as human beings since day one. I think this text gets into it. But it seems to be at least more prevalent now. the ability to speak with some sort of authority, to put up a post with some sort of authority, where we are making an argument or a claim where two things that are really not in the same ballpark appear to be logically equivalent to each other, when in fact they're not. Now, we can do this by picking up on a shared characteristic between a couple of the items in comparison, right? We can make arguments of magnitude even. When we choose one behavior that one individual engages in and we compare them to certain dictators that have left a rather ugly mark on the human history. It's one way we do it. We oversimplify the argument. We ignore or try to distract from certain things. It can represent what is called a cognitive bias. We come in with a preconceived notion with how things work, right? And then I can go into my social media feed and I can curate it so that the only thing I am ever confronted with is that which agrees with me. And actually, I don't have to curate too much. The algorithms tend to do that for me. And so I see the stuff that, agrees with my own general beliefs to begin with. And then it is easier for me to take those who are outside of that belief and dehumanize them and reduce them. Those sorts of themes are underlying themes in the text and in the interpretations of the texts that we've had. The vineyard text is a classic text. It's one that people of faith in the church have used for generations, sometimes setting up this false equivalency or this bias. The text has been used to justify God's rejection of the people Israel, choosing instead the followers of Christ. And once we prove, falsely I might add, that God has rejected the people Israel, then we can reject the people Israel. We are the chosen people. We can choose to mistreat them in some way, shape, or form. This text has been used in that way, that first part that we heard. And so we struggle with it, because we can use that text to dismiss the people Israel. We can use that text to dismiss absentee landlords. We can use the text to justify violence. We can use the text in so many different ways based on our cognitive bias, the echo chamber that we live in. We might think it's a new sort of thing because of social media, but it seems to be something that is embedded in our nature as humans, because we see it very soon after the resurrection. It begins. And certainly by the time Constantine comes along, it's in full bloom. But then there's the second text. There's the second text that comes up, and often these two are separated, but these are single moment. Jesus is in the temple, Solomon's portico, the courtyard of the Gentiles, and he is teaching. He is pushing against the leadership who has a certain way of believing and being and things along those lines. And part of that way of believing and being is that, what was the one disciple said? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Cognitive bias, right? No good person can come from that side of the tracks. No wise person can come from that town. No person chosen by God to deliver the good news could possibly come from that place. They could not believe that Jesus would be one who was chosen, who was set aside, who was anointed, called Messiah, Christ, the blessed one of God, the child of God. They couldn't believe that. And the echo chamber that they had created as leaders in their space that they had reinforced this idea. Even though there are scriptures that clearly state that God uses people outside of the community to speak to the community, we have generated a bit of a false equivalency, a cognitive bias. And so when Jesus provokes, when Jesus challenges the leaders, saying, "You've been set aside for a task and you haven't fulfilled it. New people will be brought in to lead," they decide that they're going to trap Jesus. Now, they don't do it themselves, the leaders who were offended by the first parable. They get some other folks to go in and do it. They get Pharisees and Herodians, people of faith who are Jewish but are culturally Greek, Herodians. We're going to get them to go in and challenge Jesus. "Jesus, we know you're a good person. We're going to reduce all the complexities of the world to this one thing. We're going to set up a false equivalency. Is it right to pay taxes? To give Caesar some of the money?" Now, this is another text that can be unpacked in so many different ways, but I think for what I'm interested in and what we're doing in this place on this morning, when Jesus asks for the coin, the question is, Caesar, who calls himself divine, is he in fact equivalent to God? Are they the same? There are sacred coins that are used in the temple. You are supposed to exchange your money to get the shekels to pay the temple tax that supports worship in the temple. And that is the currency that you should be carrying around when you get beyond the courtyard of the Gentiles. Interestingly, the treasury is in the courtyard of the Gentiles, so anyone can put money in if they, want to. But you should exchange it. They both have coins. The God of Israel and the emperor. Rome can be worshipped. There's Roma, and there's previous emperors. God can be worshipped. We're in the temple. So on one level, we have set up a false equivalency. They are the same. Now, they're seeking to trap Jesus because if he says, "Sure, pay your taxes," then people will be upset because who likes paying taxes? And if he says, "No, you can't pay taxes," then the Romans are upset because, well, the Romans want you paying your taxes. But the issue here is what God is worthy of your worship. It's a false equivalency. Because Rome is not God. The emperor is a human being. It should not even be part of the conversation in this way. But the Pharisees and the Herodians have put them on the same footing. They have put them on the TV show together and made them both out to be experts. The coin that represents Caesar and the coin that represents God. And by giving them equal airtime, it looks like they're one and the same. When we know that one is not. Not even close. Because of the cognitive bias that said Jesus cannot be Messiah. That he cannot speak for God. That we know what's going on. We set up this equivalency. And we're attempting to take away some of the honor as well as undercut some of the some of the authority of Christ. Which is why when he gives the response, they are utterly amazed. Because he doesn't fall into the trap. He doesn't buy into the false equivalency. He says, listen, if it's got Caesar's face on it, give it to Caesar. He can have it. But when we're talking about God, we need to be giving to God what is rightfully God's. Now, there's a whole lot more that can be unpacked in that. Because what isn't rightfully God's? But in that moment, in that place, when faced with something that very easily could have turned into a meme that goes around the world, making it look like these two are even, Jesus says this is just a coin. It's a piece of metal with a picture on it. Give it to the person who wants the metal with the picture on it. Give what you're supposed to give to God to God. And in that moment, for us who use terms like false equivalency, it's crucified. It is nailed to the cross, and it should be allowed to stay there. We know we still struggle with it. We know we still wrestle with it. We know that we still hold things up as being equal when they should not even be part of the same conversation. But we are being led to the place where we can set the one aside for what it is and embrace the other for all that it is. Thanks be to God, and amen.